Okay, let me make sure this is, yes, okay. I am here speaking with Dan Russo, who is a hedge fund manager at a large institution. We're in New York City. It is July 27th, 2011. And at the moment, we're kind of in the crisis within the crisis, it seems. The debt ceiling deadline is looming, and there seems to be no, or the parties are at an impasse. It's very unclear what's going to happen, which I want to get to all of that. But first, you and I spoke a little over a year and a half ago, late 2009. We spoke about the first phase, as it were, of the economic collapse in 2008, 2009, and the beginnings at that time of what seemed like possibly a recovery. So as a start, maybe if you could just speak in general terms, not just about the particular moment of this week, but if you could just narrate from your perspective in the financial world, how would you narrate for a layperson the story of this country's economy over the last couple of years, since about 2009 or so?
Okay. Well, thinking back, so we came through, really 2009 was very much, the residual of the crisis, which was centered around deflation in home values, which impacted large pools of residential mortgage-backed securities, which were, there were two instruments, asset instruments that were predominantly being used to express a point of view about real estate in the United States in terms of making an investment. You could either own large pools of mortgages that were in residential mortgages, or you could take the opposing view and you could buy a insurance against that pool of mortgages defaulting. And there were people on both sides of that trade. And we all know, I think everyone knows, kind of how that went. Home values started to stabilize at a high level and then started to drop. And as they dropped, the value of the large pools of mortgages fell, and the quality of the borrowers who had to make the monthly payments, in many cases, whether they were subprime or Alt-A, were unable to make those payments. So, not to get too caught up, but real estate in the United States and the deflation of real estate in the prior ensuing bubble that was created in real estate caused this enormous vacuum of return and capital and liquidity throughout the global markets. And then we know that crisis was managed by the Federal Reserve, and they did a number of things, whether it was the Troubled Asset Relief Program, otherwise known as TARP, whether it was the quantitative easing 1 or the quantitative easing 2. Those are the subsequent large steps that happened from 2009 through 2010, in concert with the historically low interest rates. That were the mechanisms that the Federal Reserve used to stimulate the United States economy so that we could get back to a period of economic growth, because this huge vacuum of return and asset value that came out of the residential mortgage environment created ripples, we all know, throughout all these other areas of the economy. It wasn't just homes and home builders, it was hard goods that go into homes, and then it was utilities that benefit from more homes being built, and so the ripple effect was significant. So the economy dropped to a very, very low level, and these mechanisms were designed to get the economy to stabilize and grow again, because in that period of economic contraction or recession, as we all know, many organizations, companies had to cut back on their overhead, and the largest line item expense in many of these P&Ls is labor, so a lot of people lost their jobs, and that became a much bigger social problem for the United States to deal with. So, kind of fast forward '09, we saw some stability, and the markets reacted favorably to that, because markets react to they discount the future outcome of a very negative recession, which they did, and we saw that precipitous fall in the markets in 2008. Then they discounted the stability and the recovery of the economy, and we saw that in 2009. And because those moves were so dramatic on both sides in terms of just S&P performance, I think there were a lot of middle class to upper middle class Americans who were invested in the stock market who recognized that this was a atypical environment, and this was probably an environment that wasn't completely within their control or understanding, and maybe they weren't as safe as they would have thought trying to invest on a discounted mechanism their retirement savings in the United States stock market. And that's a little bit of a different issue, but that was one of the outgrowths, I think, of what's happened during this extreme period of volatility where a market can go down 30% and go back up 30%. And the economy not being that huge of a different place in terms of its actual growth rate now that we're 2+ years through that. So what do? We probably stabilized things, and we were able to maintain credibility of the U.S. dollar, of U.S. Treasuries. We were able to kind of stabilize the United States banking system. We were able to, in many, avoid a run on the bank, so to speak. And we also bought forward with QE1 and QE2 some economic recovery, because we made cheap money available in businesses that had some healthy operations, whether they were multinationals or whether they were even businesses in the United States that were in service industries that were in a position to benefit from this inexpensive capital. We saw some economic growth, and the markets reacted to that. So we're kind of that's a little bit of a flavor on where we are today.
Okay. So a couple of questions just to follow up on that. The first would be, so in your view, where's the trough? Where does the U.S. economy hit bottom?
In terms of absolute number on GDP, or just in terms of what's the timing of that, or?
Yeah, what's the timing of that in terms of?
I mean, I think the bottom was in. The bottom was in '08 and in early '09, and I would say now, we are just in a, and I hate to use this because I think it's overly used, but kind of a newer normal growth environment. Mm-hmm. And that new normal is some GDP growth level on an annualized basis that's south of 3.5%. And depending on what economists you talk to and what math you use, in order to generate enough economic growth to have any sort of a material move in the unemployment rate, you need to have 3+ GDP growth, and we can't seem to eke that out.
Right. So that was my next question, actually, was the distance between kind of the barometers or the metrics that are used to call the recovery a recovery on the one hand, and the kind of flat line of unemployment at about 9% plus on the other hand. I mean, how do you understand that?
Well, I think there's a number of issues that are interrelated but not the same. I think the issue that I think nobody has completely, no one really has put forth a great plan to deal with is this this global economic shift of labor and of consumption and of overall economic growth. And I think that the last 10 years have seen economies other than the United States grow at an extremely rapid rate. And as you industrialize these nations and bring so many people into the middle class, you do create a strong global economic environment, which the United States can benefit from, but you also see a migration, a transition of skilled labor to these other markets. And when you kind of look back at the economic contraction that happened early in the decade, and you look at how businesses dealt with that economic contraction, in other words, they were faced with a slowdown in the economy, and they cut labor and they reduced overhead, and they got back on track pretty quickly. And I think that what they did through this period later in the decade was something very similar, and they just haven't had enough visibility, confidence, and or growth in their own business to staff back up. And we have to remember that the largest mechanism for increasing employment in the United States is the creation and or growth of small businesses. And because this particular economic contraction impacted small businesses so negatively in 2007 and in 2008 and even into 2009, the development of new small businesses, the growth of small businesses, the interest level of large financial institutions to lend to small businesses, the credit quality of small businesses, all those things remain in flux, they're question marks. And until those small businesses feel like they can operate without a lot of overburdensome regulation and can grow, then they're not going to borrow, and we're not going to manage through this economic, this employment contraction. And while that's going on, you have rapid growth in Asia and in India and in South America, and you have this migration of a lot of skilled labor. Many multinational companies can outsource. They can do things on a consulting basis, on a contract basis. They don't have to put them, as employees, full-time employees on the organization's, dole in the United States. They don't have to provide benefits. They don't have to provide full-time labor. They don't have to provide an office. And I think that this new paradigm of I have to compete with companies that are operating in other places around the world. The tax rate in these other places is oftentimes lower than the United States tax rate. I am being overburdened by incremental healthcare costs and incremental regulatory costs, so that takes a bite out of my margin, so then I have to manage a lower payroll overhead already. And 10 years ago, I couldn't farm out my legal to people in India and get the same quality of work that I got from a full-time employee in the United States, but that's no longer the case. So getting back to my initial point, I don't think anyone is really talking a lot about or has put forth a plan on how to manage that kind of tectonic shift of skilled labor and economic growth, and the inevitable conclusion that the United States will not always be the world's largest economy. And that is a hard realization to come to. And I think that history has proven that there are other democracies and capitalistic economies that slowly became more, I don't want to say socialized, but socialized over time because they stopped being the engine of growth that they once were. And I don't know that that's exactly where we are. There's not enough evidence that that's where we are. This still remains, the best country and best economy on numerous fronts. But I don't think anyone's really wrestling with this. So that's a long-winded.
Well, there's a sense in which, what it makes me think is that, and I've thought this for a while, that in our public debate, we've been talking with great passion, off and on, about immigration for probably 30 years, when in fact the bigger issue that kind of snuck up on us, but it shouldn't have come as a surprise, is actually the mobility of capital, not the mobility of people, but the mobility of capital. And the immigrant still makes a handy scapegoat, but the structural issues are not there at all. And I'm wondering, in policy terms, then, what can you imagine as the fix for the condition that you're describing right now?
Well, that's the $100,000 kind of question. I think that we don't have the United States government does not have the capital structure. They don't have the balance sheet in order to tackle this problem, I think the way that you would like to tackle this problem. In other words, there is truth to the statement that if I cut taxes and I create a more business-friendly environment, that I will generate more productivity, more prosperity, more innovation, more research and development, more jobs, and I will create products and technologies and systems that become demanded and become economic models for a global environment. So that's the ideal. The problem with that ideal is that we have multinational U.S. corporations that have shown that every time they get too much latitude on that front, they don't handle it with complete respect and the way that they should, whether it's environmental or whether it's social or whether it's through labor. So that's a separate issue. So there's a lot of people in this administration, and I think constituents, that don't want to give business the latitude to be in that virtuous, prosperous cycle.
Right. Well, because another way of looking at this is it turns into a kind of race to the bottom, right? As states are pitted against one another to come up with sweeter and sweeter tax deals, as nations are pitted against each other for sweeter and sweeter tax deals. I think
that's a very insightful, and I think that is at a 50,000 foot level, that's the right way to think about it. I think that we're nowhere near there yet because. And we're, you always have to recognize that the interlinking of these two large global superpowers, given how much consumption the United States has that created the wealth generation in the emerging middle class in Asia, and how much Asia lent us money to perpetuate this consumption. So we're very interlinked, and so I think if it was a complete pure play where it was, I'm competing with you on every level all the time and there's no intermingling of our fortune, then I think that race to the bottom would probably be accelerated and it would be even more evident. So I think your point's valid, but I don't think that's where we are as much.
I want to get us to 2011 in a minute, but let me ask another question. You've been in the financial world for 25 years, 20 years, 20
about since 90, whatever it is, 5, 6.
And in the course of the kind of work you do, you spend a lot of time with people in a lot of different kinds of businesses.
Correct.
Okay.
Correct.
So one of the things I'm curious about, because from the outside, it looks like the business culture of the United States has changed pretty dramatically in that time, or maybe in a little bit longer. That the culture of how boardrooms are run, how goals and aims and objectives and legitimate concerns are articulated has changed a lot. Some of the.
Are you saying like the social responsibility of a large organization versus the economic responsibility?
That would be one piece.
That's one of the things.
That's one piece of it. I guess what I'm describing more would be a little bit bigger than that, but that it looks to me like the idea that the shareholder is the constituent that you're beholden to is a relatively new idea.
Yeah.
And that if you go back 25 or 35 years, you wouldn't find a consensus on that at all.
Yeah, I think, I hear what you're saying, but I will also tell you that I don't agree with it completely. I think if the shareholder were the single most important constituent at the table of large public corporations, then we would probably see a change in senior management compensation. We would probably see a change in kind of organizational behavior as it relates to long-term strategic planning versus short-term earnings growth. And I actually think on some level the biggest paradigm shift public corporations over the course of my career has been how competitive it's become to compete on a global basis, which requires probably a different way of thinking strategically, a different way of managing your business and your capital structure. But it also has become, I do think, these organizations benefit 10 or 15 people so significantly on a financial basis that, and they are often, the boards are often, built around supporting whatever that particular management team is in place. And while they recognize shareholders will give them a very hard time if they don't manage short-term sales and earnings metrics well, they seem like their sole focus is on creating these unique monetization events so that there's an inordinate amount of wealth created in a short period of time for a small group of people. Now, that's capitalism, and that's at the core of what this entire, I think, marketplace was built on. So I don't have a judgment about that, but I think that has become more personified and prevalent in the last 10 years than it was in the prior 200. It's no longer there's no stigma attached to a CEO making $80 million in a year and making $800 million over a course of a 10-year period of time. Where I don't think that ever happened in the 70s or 80s. Now, these companies weren't as big. The global marketplace wasn't as big. The financial industry wasn't as big. Their ability to do some of the things that they're able to do to leverage growth through capital markets wasn't available. So the whole system moved with them. But I don't think shareholders are really the only constituents. I think really the constituents are senior managers and the way that their compensation packages work. Now it's not fair to paint everyone with that brush, because that isn't the case across the board, and there's plenty of examples where that's not the case. But that's been the biggest change I've witnessed.
Okay, well, so now to get to the kind of the crisis within the crisis, or the crisis that has a kind of shorter horizon on it here. Can you, from your perspective, how did we get to where we are today? And where we are today, actually I would like to hear you elaborate on this too, but where we are today seems to be, the argument about government debt has overtaken virtually everything. The routine matter of raising the debt ceiling has become a kind of high noon showdown.
Yeah.
The political universe has almost totally taken over the policy universe.
Yeah.
How, just kind of from where you sit behind your computer or behind your desk, how would you narrate, how we got to this kind of extraordinary moment?
Well, the first thing I'd say is that we've consolidated media distribution significantly into the hands of a few large outlets. Yet the consumption of that media and the mobility of that media and the speed at which that media is delivered has, increased exponentially. And I think that, which is a different conversation, I recognize, I think that those two things, the consolidation or the concentration of media in a few hands and the incremental proliferation of that media voice, is one of the main reasons why we're here today. In terms of people's reaction, the public's understanding, the politicians' behavior. It's all kind of the martini shaker is being driven by the media, and whether it's high noon or whether it's whatever the analogy is, I just don't think it's not truly appropriate. But that's what happens because they want to generate this interest level and this constant following of every and everyone hanging on every word. And I think the fact that the markets are not acting, there's been a lot of volatility. There's been a lot of volatility because of a number of issues, and we can get into them.
But certainly not as much as people might have been
so that's what I'm getting at. I think what I'm getting at is I think if you were to take the United States defaulting on not raising the debt ceiling and actually defaulting, and putting that outcome on a piece of paper and having 20 professionals, asset managers, write down what they think the outcome is, I think the majority of them would say some sort of a liquidity crisis, market consolidation, sell-off in the neighborhood of 4 to 10%. And as far as I can tell, the equity markets are behaving in a 1 to 2% band and are up 5, 6, 7% on the year, depending on the day you look at it, and are behaving somewhat rationally relative to corporate earnings that are coming through for the second
or
quarter.
relative to Congress.
Right. So, I think there's this other sideshow, which is there's such a bifurcation in the United States right now with respect to political point of view, economic health, prosperity, and that's causing both sides of the aisle to have so much anguish over managing their constituents' approval. That's really what it strikes me as is that Republicans and people who have been brought up and have built lifestyles around conservative economic policy feel completely abandoned by the current administration. And there's legitimate reasons why they feel that way. And then there's people who have been totally disenfranchised by this capitalistic environment that's been created in the last 5 years. They're out of work, they've lost their homes, they can't find work, they had education, they had the right morals, they had the right ethics, they had the right everything, and they've been disenfranchised. And I think given how strong both of those parties feel about their position and given how vocal they're being, there's this enormous gap or this impasse. And who has the ball in the next administration, who gets elected, is become a much bigger issue than today's debt ceiling, or Italy, or Greece, or anything, because we have to continue to borrow money in order to service the debt we already have. And I think everyone now kind of understands that math a little bit, but when you really stop and think about it, what it means is that forever, until we come up with something enormously significant in terms of social spending, we will not get back to even on federal deficit. And I don't think anybody realized how fast we went from being somewhat healthy and balanced to this. And now that they realize it, and no one really is willing to recognize that it's a bigger issue of this tectonic shift in global economies, then it's a fight for survival, whereas you're going to have a lot of people who support the current administration because they don't have any other answer. There's nowhere for them to go to get a job. There's nowhere so you need more entitlement, and you need more social spending, and you need to make sure that the programs that the government had in place, whether it's Medicare, Medicaid, Social Security, all these things, that they're incredibly healthy. And we frankly aren't in the position to keep them healthy. That's it, mathematically. And then you have this other conservative side that said, look, I've handled my affairs responsibly, I've built a business, I've created a career for myself and my family, this is the greatest country, we're supposed to embrace capitalism and embrace prosperity, and it isn't equal, and people do things, and it's a competitive world, and if we turn our backs to competition, it's only going to get worse, not better. And I know they're saying more than that on both sides, and those are just sound bites from me. But so I don't think that anyone's willing to come together on solving something because they're all so singularly focused on who's going to have the ball and who's going to be in the driver's seat next year. in the following year. And
yeah, okay. Well, a lot of questions come out of what you just said. First, going back to the very beginning when you were talking about the way the markets are behaving, we're now 5 days out from the deadline. How long do you think we can expect the markets to keep staying fairly level?
I think the jury's out. I think right now, when they start having, when you find both sides of the aisle having press conferences every 2 to 4 hours, but yet there's nothing substantive on the table at all, you start to get worried. You really do start to get worried, and so I think that at any moment you could have some sort of a correction. I know when I left the office at whatever it was, 2:30. We were off. Probably 1.25%, 1.5%, and these are normal moves now. A couple percent a day, which is a different conversation, but makes it challenging for people to understand why there's this much volatility. So to answer your question, I don't think there's a lot more time, but yet it strikes me like the two sides are so far apart, and that there's no credible plan on the table that we're going to go through the weekend, and we're probably not going to have a solution until Sunday night.
Is it conceivable to you that we're going to get a clean debt bill?
Oh no, this is going to be one of the like you get a Band-Aid pack and from Band-Aid brand, and you have the big ones, and then you have the slightly smaller, and you have the slightly smaller, and then you get that teeny little one that you might wrap around your pinky finger if you get a paper cut. That's what this is going to be.
So it'll be short term.
6 months.
That's it. So we get to go through this again in 6 months.
In my humble opinion.
Yeah.
And that's intentional, because if I'm a conservative and I want to continue to demonstrate how screwed up this administration got us, I'm going to continue to make people feel scared, and I'm going to use the media to my advantage. I'm going to politic. And you can't say, well, that's disgusting, why are you doing that? Because unfortunately, the administration has done it. We've had many people get on public media and say things like banks are only concerned about themselves and don't believe what they're saying, and then there's this other war on people in the financial community, and hedge fund managers paying more taxes are the solution to everything. And so that is not accurate either. I mean, couched in there is an administration that's talking about removing the mortgage interest tax deduction for all Americans. Now, that doesn't affect hedge fund managers because they own their homes. And that doesn't just affect people who own $250,000. I mean, that affects everybody. So, I think there's been significant politicking on both sides. I have a tendency to feel one way more than the other, but I recognize how far apart everybody is.
Yeah. Do you mind talking about? We've heard a lot of different versions of this. If they don't get this resolved,
right?
What happens?
Yeah, no, I think the mechanics are. I think the mechanics of it are not terrible. I think the sentiment around it is. The mechanics of it are that we will create some postponement or short-term legislation that will keep things running. So just one step further. I guess what you're asking is that if we didn't do that, then I think you legitimately start to see GDP decline fairly rapidly, because all of the government organizations which cut payroll checks to millions of people every other week would stop cutting those payroll checks, and those consumption of all those millions of people at the grocery store, on their rent and on their utilities, would probably stop for a period of time, and that would cause a consolidation. And you've seen estimates that for every month that you don't approve this, you could have a point off annualized GDP growth. I don't know if that math is too onerous, but there's definitely a cause and effect. I guess that answers your question. I don't believe on any level that anybody is going to let that be the outcome. I just think that the Band-Aid that we put on it becomes smaller and smaller and smaller until all we did was get us through, the next 3 to 6 months, which I think is where we're at. And then made the problem that we manage 3 and 6 months from now even bigger.
Mm-hmm. Right. Is there any?
I guess let me ask you this: do you think that it's politically tenable on any level to make material changes to Social Security, to make material changes to government entitlement healthcare programs, to make material changes to unemployment benefits, and to make material changes to defense? And the reason why I put defense on there too is because it's this conservative side of the debate that's not willing to cut anything on defense. And you and I have talked plenty of times over the years at how big of a proportion of the of spending defense is, and how that, and how if we were to manage that more effectively and manage that number down and relinquish the notion that we need to be as mighty as we are, then you may actually be able to make inroads on some of the other things. But until you're willing to take on those first three things that I said, which is Social Security and unemployment and healthcare, you're not going to make any headway on defense. And I just think people are in these positions, and it's like part of their DNA to say certain things are politically untenable or taboo or never on the table, and that goes back to my initial point where they just don't get it. Everything is on the table because you're going to lose your options of what's on your table, and that's the problem with the democracy. And it's really one of the outgrowths is that there's no one that really is in the position to say, for the greater good, this is the outcome. And I'm not saying I would want to change anything about living in this incredibly freedom-centric democracy. But if you go to other nations and you see and study and look at how their governments behave, they don't have 2-year plans or 4-year plans, they have 100-year plans, and the same guys are managing those plans for 20 years, and it's not a democracy, and they make hard decisions, and you can argue that they're incredibly socially irresponsible decisions, but they're managing to a much longer term strategy, and the numbers of people that they're having to worry about are so much greater, and the level of movement from poverty to middle class is happening at such a rapid rate that we're on some level the system is antiquated. I can't believe that that's really how you think about it. I don't know of a better way to think about it.
Mm-hmm. Is there anything productive that can come out of the debate that we're currently having?
Absolutely. I think the most productive thing that's coming out of this debate is that there's a lot of people, and I would assume it's slowly becoming I don't know if it's becoming a majority, but it's becoming a larger minority of people who really are in the middle of this and look at the polarization as the problem as opposed to anything else. And over time, that has a way of self-correcting. If the polarization, if the strong-minded conservatives and these and this incredibly liberal point of view, and I think to his credit, I think that the president is trying many times to come to the middle, and I'm not sure he's getting met, but that's a little different. So I think to answer the question, I think the best thing that's coming out of it is that there's this growing minority that's in the middle that's recognizing that the system and the way that the elected officials are behaving is as much a problem as the problem, and let's get on with dealing with the bigger issue, and that is, and it's going to be painful. It's going to be painful, and it just takes a long time. I mean, it's like anything else. If you have a household or a corporation, and that corporation goes bankrupt, it doesn't emerge from bankruptcy and behave prosperously 6 or 12 months after the fact. And mathematically, we remain kind of upside down. I don't want to use the word bankrupt. And the event that catalyzed it all was the economic crisis in '08, and when government started to bail out businesses that were bankrupt, and when government bailed out the U.S. banking system that was bankrupt. And I know this sounds, it sounds hyperbolic, but that was what catalyzed this. And I don't think that we've taken, and I don't know the way to take this medicine, but I don't think we've taken the medicine. And the entitlements that are inherent in being a citizen of this country are probably too luxurious for the capital structure of the country.
Where do you stand on the other side of the ledger? Revenues. What's your understanding of kind of what we're doing now and what might be done differently? That would be.
I think that's right. I think that's the right question to ask. I think that there are many problems with the federal tax code as it relates to individuals, right off the top, I tell you, I'm 100% opposed to carried interest. I think that setting up partnership corporations for profits of asset management businesses that allow income to be treated as capital gains over a long period of time is not consistent with the law that was structured around it. It's a loophole, and it's been a loophole for too long, and I think they should absolutely 100% do away with it. And I don't even think the politics around that, and I don't know this for sure, but my sense is in talking with people and getting the flavor for some people who would be impacted by that, I don't think the politics around that are untenable. I just think that...
Well, they seem to be untenable to the Republican Party.
But I think it's a certain segment of the Republican Party that believes that that's as much their constituent as anyone, and without that constituent, they may have a problem being reelected. And by the way, that's a huge problem. I think that's as much of a problem as anyone on the table. But mathematically, if you took all of this income and brought it up to, federal tax rate, the same rate that most people pay, that their secretaries pay, because people love to throw that out there, that wouldn't solve any of our problems, mathematically. It's not an overly significant number. And increasing the tax on people who use private jet service and putting a surcharge and tax on that, and doing some of these other things, while they are appropriate, I don't think that that's really what's going to solve this issue. That doesn't mean they shouldn't be done. They should be done, and I don't understand why. It just seems so obvious to me. If you're trying to convince people as a political party that you are not impossible to deal with, then these are the easy things you can do to get there. But I'll turn it on its head. They want to convince people that they're impossible to deal with, so they stand on top of these issues as a battle cry, because the majority of their support in this country are people who believe strongly in those issues. So it's the constituency being... Redistribution is a very, it's a very personal point of view, and many people believe the administration is in the business of redistributing wealth, and there are many people who have created wealth that believe they have no right to redistribute my wealth. And I think it's a contradiction to say they have no right, but then you're entitled to pay a lower tax than a guy who's got a union job. I think it's total contradiction. That's my politics, but I know why. I get a sense why they're standing so firm on some of these issues. And my guess is that issue, whether it's carried interest or taxes on on private air travel, those things end up falling by the wayside. They go away and they become less of an issue. But I don't think raising taxes, generally speaking, on everybody above $250,000 a year in annual income is something that's going to go away by the Republicans. And I don't think that that's something that is politically tenable. And I don't think that that's something that will be dealt with throughout this particular period of time. Whether it's this discussion and debate and outcome of debt crisis, or whether there's another one at the end of the year. I think they're going to leave that, and leave that issue for another day. I think, generally speaking, we either need more revenue or lower expenses, or both.
I'm curious, in the circles that you travel in, especially around business, but maybe socially also, I don't know. Largely, I presume, people who would be affected by these kinds of revenue shifts or what some might call redistribution. What's the feeling among these people about the Tea Party?
That's a good question. I don't have a great sense. I would tell you that I would say that most. It's my hunch, my sense, and I don't have anything huge to support this, that most people look at the Tea Party as being really, really too far outside of the conventional debate, and to be, overly disenfranchised to the other side, and kind of to be a disappointment for the more centrist conservative view that may have kind of existed in the Reagan years or something like that. Personally I'm frightened because I don't get most of what they say. In terms of people that I know, socialize with, people in my industry, I think most people are fiscally conservative and socially liberal, and I think that they are comfortable when there's a balance, and they're comfortable with when the majority of people's issues are met with the policy that does the least amount of harm to the majority of people. I really think that's the issue, and I don't think Tea Party people stand on that point of view at all. And I'm not sure that there are people on the far other side of the debate that stand on that point of view. Although it does seem like this particular Republican Party will use any sort of issue, even if it's a Tea Party issue, to manipulate the speaker and manipulate his handling of this debt crisis debate, and to try to convince people that this current administration is probably further to the pole than they actually are. So I think that's the politics of this situation, and I think that gives a lot of Democrats such a bad. Now we're talking a lot more about politics, but that gives people such a bad feeling about everything, about human nature and people in the country, and what are you kidding? That's become the polarizing issue. So I don't know.
How do you think that the Tea Party has come to wield so much influence in this debate? Is it as simple as just the mechanics of the nomination system, so that every Republican congressman becomes vulnerable to an insurgent candidate, or is it that the Tea Party is saying something that resonates with a lot of people? Or
I don't know that it's the second. Some people, I don't know if it's a lot of people.
Or is you started off by talking about the media. The Tea Party tends to be photogenic. Is it just that they've kind of...
It's probably the first point you made, and the media. It's probably just that Republican congressmen and senators are vulnerable, and they feel vulnerable, and the media likes these very sensationalistic type of people, because it drives the rating system that they're so beholden to, and I think that it has become circular. And so I ask myself the same question you just asked: How did they get such a big voice, and when did we all get so? When did the decibel level that you talk at start to be mistaken for intelligence? I don't know that. That to me is confusing, but it seems like that is part of it.
Well, I have two more questions I want to ask you, but first, are there any things that you would like to talk about that we haven't touched on?
No, I don't think so. What's funny is that this is a conversation about the domestic economy, and I assume global markets, particularly the United States equity market, and even for us, it turned into a discussion around politics and a discussion around the macro economy. And I guess the thing that I would say is in my career up until now, the macro economy, in other words, all the different regions and emerging economies and countries have never been so front and center in the investment debate, in the investment decision, in people's lexicon, and in what you have to pay attention to as right now. Going back as early as 2005 and 6, people didn't spend a lot of time thinking about what the capital structure was of certain countries in Western Europe. Now, granted, the EU caused some of us to focus on this more, and that common currency, but the majority of time was spent looking at companies that operate primarily domestically and can succeed or not based on definable events that are of their own kind of doing. And now you have much larger, global business climate. Most of the businesses that you would look at are global, and this macro debate and to your point, mobility of capital has become much more front and center. And I'm not even sure that it should be, and maybe that's one of the perversions that we need to grow back out of, because it's relatively new in terms of how front and center it's become. And maybe that's just part of this particular cycle, because all cycles are a little different. And it's always hard when you're in a cycle. The other thing I'd say in closing is, when you're in a cycle, it always feels a little different, because there are nuances, and wouldn't it be great if this just proves to be another economic cycle, and we see our way clear as an administration, as a population, and as an economy to grow again with innovation, with new industries, and with kind of a collective effort. And we manage through some of this deficit with a more balanced approach to spending and taxes, and we pick our head up in 36 months and we're in a much different place. Many people, and I wake up many mornings and believe
That's really how this ultimately
Well,
plays out.
that was getting to one of my last questions. So let me bracket that for 1 second, because first, before we look ahead, I was going to ask you to look backward a little bit, and just kind of thinking historically about where we are right now. What's the kind of horizon that you want to set our condition in order to really understand it? You can make the case that this is really, we're in a post-2008. Like that's all you need to know, right? Is what happened in 2008 and where we are now. There's another sense in which you could say, well, this is about kind of a post-Clinton or a post-Reagan or a post-FDR, or you could say, this is.
You could say it's post, a digital environment. It's post.
Well, say more about that.
It's post. The proliferation of the internet. I mean, I don't.
In what way would you say? Is it because of the?
I think that the internet helped accelerate secular trends that were ultimately going to come to pass based on sizes of populations and government agendas. So it's easy and this gets back to this outsourcing of labor, and it gets back to the way businesses are managed differently. I can use people all around the world at a lower cost to me as a global organization if I can react to the information that they either consume or create in real time. And the beautiful part about technology and having a method, a highway, a support system for information transmission that's instantaneous has accelerated that, to a level I don't think many people would have acknowledged. So you take a step back, and that's my point about the United States and the creation of technologies. Now, granted, we can't take responsibility for all these technologies, but most of the corporations that have created the technological horsepower to harness this instantaneous information transmission are U.S. corporations. Whether they're, now everyone recognizes Apple and how powerful of a company it is, but you go back in time and you look at all of the hardware and software companies, Oracle and Hewlett and Microsoft and all of these companies that created and Intel, better technology, cheaper, over and over and over every year, to the point where you can have this type of global supply chain, global inventory management, global manufacturing, global HR, legal, sales, so some of it's that. It's just
right.
And
So
I think people recognize that, but that goes back to that original conversation.
It's interesting though, because did people kind of misrecognize it for a time? Is this a new kind of volatility that disguised
I
itself
think it's
as
evolution
growth?
at 250 miles an hour versus life before this, which is evolution at 60 miles an hour.
Mm-hmm.
I just think it's the pace. But I think the ultimate outcome and the ultimate, because that's the way that human nature and industry works. And in theory, that's the way capitalism is supposed to work. The best product gets created at the lowest distributable price for the most amount of people. And that's why I think it's such a great system. Mm-hmm. So it's interesting, you can't overly penalize people who operate with this notion that, capitalism is the greatest path to prosperity, because it provides people who are not benefiting today the social and I guess subsidies to have the right to criticize. So it doesn't mean you're not supposed to continue to provide all of those entitlements, because that's and I think that our president believes, that's good government. The government that takes care of the most people in the most humane way is good government. And there's shades of gray all along this. It's not,
Right.
it's not, but
Yeah. Well, there are people who would say that, I mean, one of the things that is momentous about this period that we're living through right now, and you see it especially in, Wisconsin is the best example, but a number of Midwestern states that have recently elected quite extreme conservative governors. And there are people who say one of the things that's just coming to light is the ways in which capitalism, once it reaches a certain stage, is inherently at odds with democracy. What do you think of? I mean, I know you don't. I know you don't agree with that argument, but what
I don't agree with that argument. I understand. I understand it. And I don't think that it's I think that it's exactly the opposite. Capitalism isn't at odds with democracy. It's that when capitalism on a global basis means that there could be pockets of the economy that are being displaced by capitalism at work in other parts of the world. I don't know if it. Well, I don't know that it means that we're going to erode democracy. I think that it means that the democratic process has to evolve to deal with.
Right. Well, in a certain way, I think,
deal with things.
I think that in a certain way, that's what I was asking, because I mean, for the first 2 centuries, really, or at least most of the first 2 centuries of this country's history, there was a fairly facile assumption that in fact capitalism was the basis for democracy and the guarantor of democracy. And I guess what I'm asking is not so much would you agree with the extreme left statement on a place like Wisconsin, but just do you think we've moved into a period where we need to kind of ask the question anew?
Look, I really do think it gets back to just the actual balance sheet capital structure issue. That's where it keeps going back to. We had the luxury of believing that all of the entitlement and this dimension, this size of government, and this dimension of industry was normal, and I think it's very hard to rework that mosaic because it's so complicated and there's so many pieces to it. But to try to rework that mosaic, and I think it means that the government can't intervene in business, and it means that the government has to be smaller, but yet at the same time, it means that you have to stand for certain things on an entitlement basis that are truly necessary, and you try to remove all of the waste and become more efficient. And people have said everything I've just said at different points in times and in different ways, but it actually means really doing it. And that's an enormously different thing than saying it and talking about it. So I guess I'd answer your question as I don't agree with it, but I think that yes, you have to. I don't agree that capitalism has ruined democracy, but I do agree that the democracy that we know today has to evolve, and I'm not smart enough or I haven't given enough thought to what that means. It does. It needs to evolve.
Yeah. Well, last question. Looking ahead this time, and I'm a historian. I'm always supposed to be looking backward. But what's your expectation? Where do you expect? Not where do you hope, but in your heart of hearts, where do you really think we are going to be 5 or 10 years from now?
I I 10 years, even 5 years, I'm not sure I can go out that far.
Or well, how about this?
I worry. I'll try to answer it this way. I worry that some of the same issues that I was worried about in 2008, financial contagion, the lack of value in a paper currency, which is backed by nothing other than the faith of a government that has potentially pushed the pendulum a little too far. That contagion changes in a irreparable way some of the things that we have taken to be, basic tenets of life in the United States. I worry about that for my kids and my grandkids. I don't worry about it like it's front and center, but I worry about it like it's not impossible. I worry about it like it's within the realm of outcomes. And prior to 2008, for me, it never entered my mind. And maybe that's, a statement about how I didn't completely get the gravity and the math, the actual math of what we went through. But I do believe this. I do believe that any country throughout history, all the way back, as far as you go, if they tried to solve the problem that we have by simply printing more money, they ultimately compounded their problem. And I believe that if the United States continues to use the stimulus through printing of currency, and that's a very slippery slope in the not too near future. So where do we see us? In that my 3 to 5 year view is more in that this is a cycle, and we're going to work it through. And going back to my earlier comments, that's where I try to live. That's where I try to think. And I think most people are there, understandably so. But this outside risk of contagion is real. It's real, and if we keep doing the things that we've been doing, and the problem is that people who are in this debate right now in the administration know that it's real, and know that the problem is the way that the debate's being handled, but there's absolutely no evidence of change. So, what do they say? Being crazy is simply doing the same thing over and over again and expecting a different outcome. I mean, that's the definition of it. So what does that say? We're doing the same thing over and over again. I feel powerless on that front, and I don't like that feeling. I know most people who are capable and intelligent and well educated and financially stable and lead normal, healthy, well-adjusted, functioning lives feel powerless, and I think that is not a good thing.
Dan Russo, thank you very much. Always an education. If we default, I want to talk to you next week.
Yeah.
Otherwise, maybe we can talk again in a year.
Okay.
Great. Thank you.
Thanks.